It's 2 o'clock, so we'll get started now. There are probably some more people rolling in as we go, but we'll do a couple of admin things, and we'll see if people are still coming in. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This webinar is presented by the National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy, or the NCCHPP. We plan to be online for at least an hour and up to an hour and a half today. The webinar will last for 1 hour, including some pauses that we'll take for questions and other kinds of interaction. And after that, we'll stay on the line with those of you who'd like to continue a discussion or ask some more questions. So the recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint, we will make those available online, and we'll send out a link to everyone either later today or tomorrow. Please note that we are recording this, and that anything you write in the chat box will be visible there in the recording. At 3 o'clock, we'll stop the recording, and we'll continue the discussion that follows from there. If you have any technical troubles, please use the chat box to write to our colleague, Mylène Maguire, who's with us here in the office in Montreal. Thank you, Mylène, for your help with the technical side of things. Okay, we have, well, we're approaching 40 people online now, so that's going to make for some bit of a challenge in terms of communicating together, but we hope you'll use the chat box for questions or any comments you have during the discussion. There's also a great deal of expertise on the line amongst the participants, so we hope that you will share that with the group as we go. We will stop a number of times during this first hour to respond to questions, etc., and we will be keeping an eye on the questions in the chat box as we go, so please don't hesitate to write in the chat anytime whenever a question arises or a comment. We have no conflicts of interest to declare. Okay. The National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy is part of a network of 6 collaborating centers financed by the Public Health Agency of Canada. The centers are located across Canada, each with its own area of interest and expertise. The NCCHPP is hosted by l'Institut National de Santé Publique du Québec. My center's mandate is to support public health actors in their efforts to promote healthy public policies. By healthy public policies, we mean those policies that are outside of the health sector, but which have effects on the health of the population all the same. For example, these might be policies related to adequate housing, to access to healthy food, education, transportation, sufficient income, and so on. Our interest in ethics stems from the recognition that an ethical dimension is essential to informing policy and program development, both in public health and anywhere else. When you registered for this webinar, we asked you a couple of questions just to get a sense of what your level of knowledge is with respect to public health ethics, to paternalism, and with respect to ethics frameworks for public health. Your responses helped to guide us in developing this webinar. I just want to show you a couple of the results from that. You indicated that you were more comfortable with your knowledge of public health ethics in general than you were with the concept of paternalism. We have a little over 80% saying, I have read a bit on the subject, or I'm somewhat familiar with it, or more for public health ethics, and it's less so. The curve has shifted much to the left for paternalism. And we saw the same thing for ethics frameworks for public health as well. Shifted a little bit to the left, so a little less familiarity, according to you. So our focus today is going to be primarily on paternalism, but we will also touch a little bit on ethics frameworks, but just a bit. All right, so here's a brief overview of what we would like to do today. First, we want to present the concept of paternalism in public health. And after that, we want to discuss an approach for analyzing the paternalism or the kinds of paternalism that one finds in certain policies or programs in public health. At this point, I will pass the microphone over to my colleague, Maxime Plante.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. There are 3 main learning objectives for us today that we would like to achieve. First, that you be able at the end of the seminar to identify the main ethical issues associated with paternalism in public health. Secondly, that you distinguish different types of paternalism and to assess their ethical burden. And most importantly, that you be ready to use a clear and nuanced approach to support ethical deliberations on paternalistic policies in public health. All right, so let us begin with the definitions to make sure that we all have a common understanding of what paternalism is. It's been proposed that paternalism is the interference of state against an individual, against their will too, and motivated by the claim that the person interfered with will be better off or protected from harm. So as you see, the word has its root in what a father would do. So what is important here is that paternalism refers to actions or interventions that are like those of a parent who is limiting his children's freedom or decides what is best for them. Here are some examples of public health policies that have been called paternalistic. It includes policies like prohibition of sale of cigarettes, alcohol, or cannabis, the mandatory seatbelt use in car, or the use of helmet for motorcycling, or things like taxes on sugary drinks, alcohol, or cigarettes. It is worth noting here that these policies have done a lot of work to prevent or reduce harm, and we might want to reflect on why these policies have been so attractive or justified from a public health perspective. There are, we think, two main reasons for that. The first one relates to what we call the epidemiological shift, which is the idea that in the 20th century, and in wealthier countries anyway, chronic diseases and injuries have progressively replaced communicable diseases as the leading causes of morbidity and mortality. So basically now, the causes are more about lifestyle than they are about infection. And that has a great deal of influence on our policy, because it's been argued that as this shift in causes occurred, paternalistic policies look like a better adapted means for intervention. In fact, it's been argued that they may be more effective and that they could produce changes more quickly, as awareness campaigns are less effective than coercion. It's been said, it's not properly demonstrated. It's also been said that it could be more efficient because, as you well know, industry invests massively to ensure that citizens will get into the habit of regularly consuming certain products. So trying to counterbalance these campaigns with prevention campaigns, for example, would be significantly more costly than simply limiting the options. And finally, paternalistic policies also have been said more equitable because information campaigns tend to increase health inequalities, researches show, because there tend to be more uptake by and therefore more benefit to the more well-off. This is somewhat counterproductive because the least well-off are the population that one wants to prioritize. So these observations lead us to ask if paternalistic policies are better adapted to making a difference for today's public health issues. What is exactly the problem with them, and why should we worry about them, and why have a webinar focusing on them today? In order to draw out some of the issues that are associated with paternalism in public health, we're going to propose a little scenario. Well, one or two little scenarios to be more exact. We will let you read it and then ask you to respond, as there will be a survey that will be put on your screen. We will let you answer in the two scenarios, and then we will post the results at the end, and everyone will be able to see them. So don't be afraid to post your answer.
So we have a majority so far, a growing majority who are opposed, but about a third of people are in favor of the policy against sugary drinks. About 10% not sure. evening out a bit. About approaching 50% opposed to it, 40% in favor of it, 10%, 10 to 15% now, I don't know. Okay. Let's move on. Now here's the second one for you to consider and vote upon. Looks like we have a little bit more of a consensus in the early going. A little more clear in terms of the group's assessment of this one. Just under 10% in favor of this policy, 3/4 opposed to it, and 10-15% I don't know. Okay.
All right, so
Thanks for that.
let me tell you a little bit about the goal here that we had when we were designing this scenario. The goal was to test your tolerance for paternalism and to, in this case, the government interference, and to see if that tolerance varied according to the lifestyle habit that was subject of the interference. So as you see, it kind of is difficult to determine why we are more willing to accept interference in one case, so sugary drinks, but less so in the other case, the red wine case. Even though, after all, we had very similar information about them in terms of scientific data. So this helps us to sum up a bit of the issue about paternalism. And basically, there are two sides to the problem posed by paternalism. The first issue is knowing at what moment a public policy that interferes with people's freedom is justified, and at what moment it goes instead too far in limiting their right to determine for themselves how they want to live. So this is indeed a very difficult problem to sort out, and that is precisely why we call it an ethical dilemma. So the second issue is that we can ask ourselves how far government or state beneficence should go, and at what point it becomes counterproductive. We could make the argument that a democratic state is supposed to be made up of citizens who are responsible and capable of making autonomous, informed, and critical decisions. So we could say that if the state makes all of these decisions, difficult decisions on people's behalf, it's not encouraging them to develop their autonomy. So basically, that's why we think paternalistic policies can be seen as double-edged swords. We're going to take a break here for a few questions if you have anything came up in this first part, and then we're going to proceed with the second part.
Just take a moment to give you a moment to think, and if we see some people typing, we will wait for you and see what you have to say as a question or comment. Okay, I don't see anyone typing, so we will move along. But again, feel free to pose questions all along the way because we can pull them up later the next time we stop. Okay?
All right, so we're now going to focus on a practical approach and on some tools to help you in the ethical analysis of paternalistic policy. We've divided the approach in three broad steps. The first step is meant to determine if the policy is actually or not paternalistic. The second one aims to identify the types of paternalism in question and their ethical burden, which basically means we want to know how problematic they are. And the third step will be to expand our ethical analysis of the paternalistic policy. So I think we can, just to think about the goal here of this whole approach, I think we can probably all relate to the idea that we carry something like a moral compass that lets us know if things are right and okay or if they are not. We rely on these ethical intuition often, and they often operate in the background. Things for us seem acceptable or not, okay or not, and we don't really think too much about them. The goal here is to make this work more explicit and to use an approach that is rigorous and not so intuitive. So the approach aims basically to help you guide and inform deliberation and decision making. We hope it can help you to ask good questions, but we want to make clear that it will not give you all the answers at the end of the day. So the first step, we want to determine if the policy is actually paternalistic. That can maybe seem a bit obvious, perhaps, but it is often the case that people jump too quickly to the conclusion that it is. This might be an honest mistake, made in good faith, of course, but it also can be a way to discredit a policy that one opposes, since paternalism tends to be viewed in a very negative way. So we've drawn a few examples from newspaper of this. So examples of this rhetorical or political use of the label paternalism. So as you can see, it can really be used to try and influence the public debate. So we want to determine if the policy is actually paternalistic. So we're going to ask if the policy interferes with people's freedom or autonomy. So what is important here is really the notion of interference. Let's take a recent example to illustrate it. The new Canadian Food Guide was recently published, as you well know, and some people will criticize it by saying that the government is telling us what to eat, and so that's paternalistic. But if we think about it for a moment, here the government is not really putting food in anyone's mouth, and they're not going to follow us either at the grocery store. So when there's no interference, as it is the case here, we can talk about whether or not the government is infantilizing us as citizens, but strictly speaking, this is not paternalism. As you see, we put infantilized in quotation marks here because it really is a question of perspective. Another person could really see the policy as an indicative incentive. Okay, so now let's consider a case where there really is interference going on. Doesn't that automatically mean that the policy is paternalistic? Well, not necessarily. It will depend on the reason why the state is interfering. Let us use an example. Since 2015 in Quebec, and I think even more earlier than that in the other provinces, it has been illegal to smoke inside a car in the presence of a person under 16 years of age. However, we all know that we can still smoke alone in a car. So what makes the difference in these two cases? Why is the prohibition deemed to be legitimate in one case, but not in the other one? It's because of what we call the arm principle. So what's the arm principle? It's a principle that has been stipulated by John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, and basically it means that the only reason why we can use the state power to limit someone's liberty is to prevent him from doing harm to others. So limiting him for his liberty for his own good was not, for Mill anyway, sufficient warrant. So to summarize here, there is paternalism when you interfere with someone for their own good, but if you do it to protect someone else, we more properly talk about the arm principle. Just to make this distinction between paternalism and the arm principle more clear in a practical sense, here is a case for us to consider. It relates to a proposed law that you perhaps have recently heard about in the news. The intention is to ban all the sale of cigarettes in Hawaii in, I think, 5 years from now. So you have on your screen a summary of the legislation, which includes the principal objectives according to the lawmakers. So is this policy a case of paternalism, or would you associate it with the arm principle, or is it for you both? take a minute or two to write what you think about this in the chat box.
So effectively, they're talking about a ban on the sale of cigarettes implemented over the course of 5 years. So when we talk about paternalism versus the harm principle, do you think it's to protect people against themselves or to protect people against harm from others? A couple of people typing. Two different takes on the harm principle. Very interesting. There's someone who says both. I think both could be an appropriate answer as well. Given personal impact and also harm caused by cigarettes. Yep. I'm going to point out a parallel kind of case that could be justified with respect to guns and assault rifles. Another says it's both. Ollie, I'd be interested to hear you say more about the harm reduction approach and what. Not sure entirely certain what you're saying there. Barry says, principally to protect people from themselves, but there is no conflict because we do not use the million version of the harm principle in public health in Canada.
That may be true, though, but the Supreme Court does it. It's a principle that is appealed to by the court when they have to rule on cases that impede or limit individual freedom. So you might say that this is Supreme Court cases and it's not public health, but it's still the ethics domain. So I partially agree with you there.
Okay, thanks everyone. We will continue and we'll keep an eye on further comments and questions. We've got a couple questions from earlier that we'll address in a moment. Just to move along, let's continue the discussion and let's proceed as though step one showed that the policy in question is indeed paternalistic. Clearly there are both sides represented here, and I think that's quite appropriate, but we'll just proceed as though, okay, we've done analysis on the policy and we've decided that there's certainly a substantial paternalistic element to deal with. Is this a catastrophe? That's our next question, and we would say no, certainly not. It's not a catastrophe. But the fact that it is paternalistic does not automatically mean that a policy is unjustifiable or ethically inappropriate. We do need to take account of it, but it's not necessarily enough to dismiss the policy out of hand. And that's one of the main points we want to make today. Step two sets out to assess the ethical burden that the policy imposes due to paternalism. A greater burden will mean that the policy will be harder to justify, and vice versa. A lesser burden due to paternalism will mean that the policy will be easier to justify. Certainly that aspect will be. The main thing is that some kinds are more serious than others. More specifically, we want to look at the extent to which the policy conflicts with freedom and autonomy. So, researchers have identified and proposed several distinctions and many types of paternalism. We can't address them all, but we will focus on three pairs of distinctions that we think are most important and that we would argue that would do the job for our purposes today. Those three are strong and weak paternalism, coercive and non-coercive paternalism, and trivial and fundamental paternalism. And we'll move right to the distinction between strong and weak paternalism. Looking at this distinction has us determine whether the policy interferes with free and informed choices. Strong paternalism will be that which interferes with choices that are thought out, informed, and deliberately taken, while weak paternalism will be one that interferes with choices that were not. So, again, we want to look back to our case from Hawaii, and we want to, regarding cigarette sales, and we want to ask you just to quickly reflect on whether you'd say it's a case of strong or weak paternalism. So, does the policy interfere with free and informed choices? That's the question put very plainly. We have a couple of people speaking up for strong. So the choices that are being interfered with are free and informed. Everybody so far is voting is saying it's strong paternalism. Here's one for weak. The decision to smoke is not free and informed. And that echoes something that was said earlier, protecting against others. We've still got people responding. Take another moment to see what you have to say. Another vote for weak, one for yes and no. Presume that means yes, it's strong, and no, it's not. Yes, that clearly reflects two sides to it. On the one hand, the state deciding what people should do. The other side, organized tactics to make people choose to smoke. That's an interesting take. Okay, it differs according to different people. Yes, I think that's an interesting point, and that, I mean, for someone who's already a smoker, there's one way of looking at it. For somebody who's been smoking for 30 years, their addiction might make their choice to smoke or not smoke less informed. It may be more weak paternalism due to addiction, less voluntary, sorry. For someone who's not smoking, maybe they will be. Okay, very interesting comments, thank you. So, it's clearly not always easy to identify a policy as a case of strong or weak paternalism. And some are both. But when we're thinking about whether something is weak or strong paternalism, there are two criteria in particular that can be very helpful for helping to sort it out. The first one is autonomy, and we can simply note that some people are not sufficiently autonomous to be able to make decisions for themselves. Like, case in point is very young children, for example. They may not be able to decide certain things for themselves, and so we make the decisions for them, quite unproblematically. We override their freedom for their own good, and there's reason for that, and that's based on their autonomy. But we can also include some adults who are non-competent or whose autonomy is compromised in this as well. They may need some help also with decision-making for their own well-being. So autonomy is one criterion, and another one has to do with the circumstances. So some circumstances or situations are such that a person may not be in a position to make an informed decision. In a case like that, the state might justify an intervention to protect that person, and it may interfere with them. This would apply to a situation where, for example, there were intoxication or addiction involved. It might also extend to situations like pressure sales tactics, decisions about, well, perhaps decisions that are made when someone's in a highly emotional state, or especially situations involving cognitive bias. We've been hearing a lot about cognitive biases in the last few years. Briefly, they are systematic deviations in the manner in which we treat information, which affects decision making. There are dozens and dozens of these documented, and they show very clearly that being a competent adult doesn't mean that one always makes what we would call rational decisions. So the difficulty here is to determine when conditions are sufficiently inhospitable to inform decision making that we would call an intervention an instance of weak paternalism. And it is a rather big issue because there are many theorists who say we don't really have a problem with weak paternalism. It's not a big deal. And so the way in which you determine that can have a big effect for whether a policy will be viewed as being more or less acceptable. So it's not irrelevant, this distinction. One other point to make about this before moving on is that people's everyday decisions and habits, what we might call lifestyle decisions, we can ask if these reflect voluntary and informed decision-making or if they're more automatic. Are they semi-conscious or even unconsciously made? Should we consider interventions upon these kinds of situations as being strong or weak paternalism? It's not at all easy to be sure about this. So that's a quick overview of the difference between strong and weak. We'll move on to coercive and non-coercive paternalism now. This distinction looks at how much constraint is placed upon someone by an intervention. And by extension, it looks at the extent to which the intervention encroaches upon individual freedom. The UK-based Nuffield Council on Bioethics proposed a tool for determining the degree of coercion imposed upon people by different types of interventions, and this took the form of a ladder. So the idea is simple enough. The higher you climb on the intervention ladder, the more coercive the interventions are that you'll find there, and the more that they impede individual freedom. Now note that there's no clear boundary between coercive and non-coercive in this. It's a little bit fuzzy. It's somewhere in the middle of the ladder, and that could be debated. But just to say, there's no clear demarcation between coercive and non-coercive when you're looking at the Nuffield ladder. A much noted problem with this ladder is that it seems to show that any state action beyond non-intervention, right at the bottom, do nothing or monitor, anything beyond that, according to this conception, that's going to be somehow conceived as limiting freedom. By providing information and making options available, we can rightly ask, do these actually impede freedom? And as we'll see, I mean, we could rather say that these sorts of things can enable an individual to better exercise his or her autonomy. And so that leads us to Griffiths and West. These two researchers in 2015 took the intervention ladder and reconceptualized it. They proposed that we rethink it in order to better account for what they saw as the autonomy-promoting aspects of some interventions. Some things are clearly limits on freedom, and those are at the bottom of this ladder, and those match what we saw on the other ladder as well. They're clearly interfering with freedom. But the different conception of freedom here means that educating and ensuring that more choices are available means that such options actually enhance freedom. So we don't view them as limiting freedom. We view them as making more space for freedom. We'll only touch upon this very briefly, but if you find this perspective interesting, the reference to this paper is at the end of this presentation. The link is available. So I will pass the microphone back to Maxime now. We'll continue.
All right, so we will proceed to the last of the three distinctions, so the distinction between trivial and fundamental paternalism, which is a distinction that looks pretty simple, right? I mean, I think we are all used to the idea that we have fundamental rights as guaranteed by Constitution. You have the Charter, the Canadian Charter on your screen right now. So it defines a series of fundamental rights, belief, expression, religion, etc. And a policy that interferes with a fundamental right would qualify as fundamental paternalism, obviously. Such a policy would be not only difficult to justify ethically, but it will also be difficult to justify legally, as it is often the case of Supreme Court. So I wanted to draw your attention to another right, because the Canadian Charter also includes a right to liberty, and that kind of complicated things a little bit for us. What is exactly this right to liberty? It has long been understood as something like the freedom to move or the freedom to control your own body, but since Morgenthaler and the rulings on abortion in the 80s, the courts have come to recognize the right to liberty to guarantee that individuals have a measure of personal autonomy relating to personal decisions about their bodies, their private lives, and their most intimate decisions. For example, getting medical aid in dying, or as I said earlier, abortion. So the question is here, how far do such rights extend? If we take the case from New York, the recent case when Michael Bloomberg set out to limit mega serving sizes for sugary drink, you will probably recall that there was a lot of opposition to that, so much so that we saw, for example, on the left of your screen, the right to consume mega cups of soda aligned with an image of the Statue of Liberty. So just for out of curiosity, what do you think of this one? If we were to ask you the question, do you think this is a fundamental freedom or a trivial one? Take a moment to vote on this as we have displayed the survey on the screen.
Fairly clear consensus. No devil's advocates yet.
It's a landslide.
Yeah. And viewed as being a trivial liberty by 90%. Okay.
Okay.
So that does the trick.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's give us a pretty clear picture that of your answers. Your response reflects the consensus view in Canada. It's interesting to note that in 2003, the Supreme Court was asked exactly the same, well, not almost exactly the same question that we have just asked you. In fact, the court had to rule on a case of a man who was arrested while smoking cannabis and who defended himself by saying that prohibiting him from smoking cannabis was contrary to his right to liberty because it was an integral part of his way of life. So, well, unfortunately for him, the Supreme Court ruled that the right to liberty could not be extended to protect everyday activity that a person chooses to define as part of their way of life. So it has a lot of consequences for us because it means that the behaviors that relate to habits, way of life, lifestyle, or individual preferences, all of those end up being placed among the trivial freedoms and not the fundamental ones. However, we should not take this to mean that trivial paternalism is unimportant paternalism or even banal paternalism. And just because something touches upon a trivial right does not automatically mean that the intervention is justified and that its object is unimportant. There are at least two reasons, I think, for that. The first is that preferences, habits, and way of life can have cultural dimensions that are strongly embedded in people's lives. I think the better example of that is our dependency, or at least our transportation habits that are so deeply rooted in our lives, they would be really hard to change. So it's also, the second reason why it's important is because we live in a pluralistic society that recognizes a measure of openness to diverse values. So that just means that we usually respect people's freedom to choose how they want to live. So if tomorrow we, for example, the state decided to impose a vegetarian diet on everyone, citing, let's say, the benefits of healthy eating, the plan might be legally acceptable, though that would be up for debate. But I'm pretty sure it would be much more difficult to justify ethically, and I'm absolutely sure that it would not be accepted in practice given how strongly anchored people's eating habits are. So we're going to have a little time for questions.
I don't have this one in front of me now. It's gone by from a little earlier, but I'll just start with this one while you think about whether you have any further questions to pose. One person asked, is not all policy intended to impact behavior? Kind of an interesting point and a little bit tricky to respond to, but I think one way of looking at it would be that all policy ought to be intended to impact something, but the way in which you focus on things may be different. For instance, if the federal government were to impose regulations to limit certain types of pesticide use, it may be doing so in order to ultimately make sure that certain things aren't being done. But it'd be more, I think, a question of, it'd be based more on an idea of protecting the public. Whereas if you look at a different kind of intervention, like saying everyone is obliged to wear a helmet while riding a motorcycle, it's a less diverse and less diffuse kind of protection that is being mandated, and it's intended to protect the individual from his or her own self, i.e. crashing a motorcycle while not wearing a helmet. So the distinctions that we're looking at here with respect to paternalism are more to do with a motorcycle helmet law and people's alleged right to be able to say, no, this is my business, and I can decide for myself about this. And what is the limit of the state with respect to that individual's right to ride a motorcycle without a helmet? So maybe they're all intended to influence behavior ultimately, but different ways of looking at them show them to be influencing things at a more population level or at an individual level, and there are different implications for each.
I'd like to, there was a lot of interesting comments. I'm not going to have the time to address them all, but I want to come back on a question by Aurelia Gomez-Ramirez, who asked if autonomy of individuals is the ultimate deciding factor in whether a policy is paternalistic or not, and whether it should be passed or not, and if there is room to consider collective well-being. It's a good question because it shows that what we're trying to do here today with you is to show that the ethical dilemma with paternalism is that when you stop putting one value higher than any other, like individual freedom or collective well-being, and the problem begins because the problem really is what you do if you don't want to put individual liberty on top of all other values or other values for that matter. So there is no ultimate deciding factor, or it will always be dependent of in-context analysis. So that would be, that's what we're trying to give you the tool today to do.
Near the end of the thread of comments, I see an interesting one from Sandra Woods, and it's relating to the social acceptability of things that increases over time. People become more accustomed to it. She says, how many participants here would be against policies that were imposed in the past? For example, drinking and driving only became illegal in Canada in the 60s, she believes. Would this be voted against today where it's still legal? I think that's an excellent point. And one example that also comes to mind is the seatbelt laws, which came out, I guess, at the end of the 70s. And they're extremely paternalistic. Certainly for a car with only one person in it, you could argue that with two people in the car, a seatbelt protects one from another bouncing around, but I bet there was a lot of fuss when that was introduced because people weren't habituated to it, didn't necessarily accept it. But nowadays, it's much more accepted. So, good point. 2:45. I think we'll move on. Okay. Okay, so in step 1, we briefly looked at how to determine if a policy is paternalistic or not. In step 2, we characterized some different types of paternalism so that we could see if they pose more or less of an ethical burden. And we're really not advocating for ranking different kinds of paternalism, as this one's definitely worse than that one. It's always going to be context-based. But in general, we can say that strong paternalism is going to be more ethically problematic than weak paternalism. Coercive is going to be more of a burden than non-coercive. And in general, fundamental is going to be more of a burden than trivial. Just that, just the way they stand in relation, but not ranked beyond that. In step 3, where we've arrived now, the plan is to figure out if the policy can be ethically justified. And that's going to mean that we have to step back a bit and expand the debate beyond just a simple consideration of paternalism. And we have to do this because the problem of paternalism is just one among many. And there are a lot of values other than individual freedom and state beneficence that we have to consider in order to make a justified and better informed decision. So there's a real temptation at times to reduce the analysis to just the paternalism involved in the case and just the autonomy. There tends to be a lot of emphasis on freedom and autonomy at the expense of other values that are arguably extremely important and not necessarily less important than autonomy. So in order to expand the analysis into a larger scenario or a broader way of looking at things, let's just imagine, for example, a policy that affects the freedom of a population. Let's say we make a certain vaccination obligatory. It's quite possible that you could look at that intervention solely on the level of improving individuals' well-being. You may well judge that it's not justified due to a measure of paternalism in it. You might come to that conclusion. But you might also appeal to other principles like common good. There we go. A common good in this might be realizing or getting to a herd immunity threshold, and that'll protect everyone. You might also appeal to social justice, which would have you looking out to protect the most vulnerable. These are considerations that could lead us to change our decision. You know, we're not making a judgment on this, but it's just to say that these things might balance against the other in a way that would, when you add in other dimensions to the discussion, they might lead you to change your decision about whether the policy is justified or not. And it's definitely not easy to judge if the addition of other considerations will sufficiently shift the balance between benefits and burdens to justify an intervention. But frankly, that's one of the biggest jobs in doing an analysis of the ethics of an intervention. It's looking at the burdens, it's looking at the benefits, and it's trying to sort out how to work them together and how to balance. It's probably, balancing those values is probably the most difficult and delicate aspect of an analysis. There are tools that can help you to proceed in this process. We certainly will mention public health ethics frameworks, for example, as a much used tool for helping to do this kind of work. But that said, ethics frameworks are way, way, way better at helping to raise issues than they are at helping you to do the tough deliberation and balancing that you have to do. That is really hard deliberative work, and a framework typically will not be as helpful at that. The NCCHPP has put together a repertoire of about 30 public health ethics frameworks that we think are useful, and we will give you a link to those among the resources at the end of this presentation. If you're already using a framework in your workplace, that's great. And just to let you know, we are presently working on a framework for public health ethics that focuses specifically on analyzing paternalistic policies in public health. That'll be coming out sometime in the future. For our purposes today, though, and due to the fact that we don't really have enough time to pick up a complete ethics framework, present it, use it together, we're going to just quickly go through a few ethical principles with you. Just a few, and some that are normally used to guide ethical analyses. Clearly, these are not the only ones, but the ones that we'll mention here and the ones that we'll solicit from you will probably be among the main ones that are used in the frameworks we've dealt with. Here are just a few that we've selected. We've already touched on respect for autonomy and beneficence. We've also mentioned equity already. We mentioned efficiency, which is more or less related to cost effectiveness and being able to get the job done with the least resources. That's certainly an ethical principle or value. Citizen participation is super important, and I think everybody's familiar with that, but making sure that the populations and the groups who are affected by policy options take part in the process, both in terms of making priorities and in the development process policies. The question of proportionality is also very important. It means, are you using the right size of intervention for the size of the problem? Is it like using a massive dump truck to move a spoonful of dirt, like in terms of the burdens that an intervention might produce? Is it balanced against the trouble that you're trying to address? Beneficence we've talked about, and effectiveness, of course, which is one way of asking, does this program or does this policy work? Now, when we can mention a few principles here, I'm going to ask you to mention any others that come to mind that you think are important, particularly with respect to the case of the eventual tobacco sales ban in Hawaii. So if some come to mind for you that are essential to that case, give those some thought and maybe you could mention them to the group as well. So given the time that remains, we've got maybe 5 minutes or so, and again, we'll stay on the line afterwards, but in the 5 minutes or so that remain, we'd like to go back to that cigarette sales case from Hawaii. And we'd like to, in a very open way, reflect together on the values that you think are most relevant to this case. Let's hear from you which ones you think could be appealed to in order to support the legislation, for example. And we've seen some comments already in the chat about that. But let's see if we can come up with some values. Can you think of any values that would count against this proposed legislation? Is there any reason that it should not be applied? And are there any values or issues in particular that jump out for you as being essential to consider? This is a larger question. Are there any other issues to worry about? You can think of a few and maybe we'll prompt you with a few later. But let's just start by asking, are you for or against the implementation of this proposed law? And then we add, why? So on the screen here, we've indicated 3 reasons given by the legislator that are elicited in support of that legislation. We have a number of people typing. Maybe people could just comment on whether you'd be for or against the implementation of this law to start with. Just elicit some thoughts on that. This is legislation that was just proposed last month and it was in the media, so it's very current. we're going to see people both for and against. And if you do come in with a for and against, we invite you also to comment on the why aspect of it once you've made a call, and feel free to change your mind, of course, because there are arguments being put out here. We see a comment about concern with full prohibition would be to increase the black market. Interesting point, because there's an unintended but inevitable consequence of a ban. Against only due to negative impact of prohibition. Yeah, and black market would be among those negative impacts. Someone who's for, because smoking is not really an individual's free and informed decision. And then, yes, this decision or seemingly personal lifestyle decision is shaped by the broader context of intense marketing, lobbying, and coercion of cigarette companies. Yes, and we often hear people appeal to, no, it's freedom, and I can do what I like, but that may not reflect the whole picture of what's going on in the ways in which people make choices during the course of their lives. So,
there's an interesting aspect is that we can, when we have to assess an intervention, it's really difficult to distinguish, to separate the means of intervention than the ends that it tried to accomplish. So in this case, the end is really, I think, noble, but it really is in the means that I think most of you will probably have some doubts, because we might argue that the ban is debatable and probably not the best option, but I think we all agree that cigarettes, it has come to a point where we need to act against this, and more than we've been doing up until now.
Okay, we've got a comment that definite concern that some of the most vulnerable will gain access in a higher risk place with a higher risk product. Interesting. Doubt that this would effectively support quitting. Would need to consider impact on preventing initiation. There's a big effort being made around the world to get people going, and there's another big effort to get people to stop. Gary Papes is for. Effective public health interventions are fundamentally paternalistic. If it is assessed as a politically and logistically feasible intervention, we may need to be comfortable, even embrace the paternalism. There's definitely a balance to be found in there, to not automatically reject something paternalistic. On the other hand, to take very seriously and engage with communities who reject interventions for their paternalistic aspects. Public health is, I think, by its very nature, in many ways, there is paternalism in it, and it's most effective in some ways when it's paternalistic, but that comes at a cost. So yes, agreed. I see we're approaching the hour, so what I'm going to propose is that we keep the recording going for a couple minutes just to catch any last comments before we shut it off. And I will pass through 3 or 4 slides just to make sure that the references and the additional resources that we were going to make available are available to people in the recording. And then we'll shut off the microphone, and for those of you who wish to stay on for a bit, we will continue the conversation with you off the recording. I'll just pass to Maxime
Yeah. Just to a few seconds to conclude and to wrap it up, we think that paternalism is a raw nerve. in the population because it puts individual freedom and state beneficial intention. We've also seen, though, that being labeled paternalistic or paternalism as such should not signal the death of a policy proposal, and that there are tools for analyzing the paternalistic ethical burden. And also that the best approach to deal with paternalism is to integrate it into a broader ethical inquiry that allows you to more rigorously assess whether a policy can or not be justified.
I want to thank you all for your comments. They're super interesting, and if we've missed any of them along the way, we apologize. We're going to read these afterwards. Just a couple of things I want to point out to you as resources. One, on the right side, the briefing note on the ethics of paternalistic policies in public health. This is a publication that we produced about a year ago now, and that served as the base for the material in this presentation today. There's a link to that. It's available online, and we hope you'll take a look if you haven't already. Also, I mentioned earlier a repertoire of ethics frameworks for public health. This is just a list of about 30 frameworks, and we've provided links to the original documents where they're available. I think only one of these is paywall, so 29 out of 30 are available, and there are also adapted summaries of some of them available as well. So if you're looking for frameworks, that might be a good place to go. Our references, or so briefly. And for those of you who will be seeking continuing education credits, we're going to send everyone an email with a link to the evaluation form for this webinar. We hope you'll fill it out. But if you want to obtain a continuing education credit, you'll need to go through the evaluation form, fill it out. And once you have finished that, then you will receive, I think it's another link that will take you to another form for requesting your credit. Yeah, that's how it goes. So that's the pathway to getting your continuing education credit. At this point, I don't see any more chat, so I think we'll turn off the recording, and we will stay online for a while if people want to continue the discussion. And we would suggest that first we'll turn off the microphone and then we'll move on. So for those of you who are not staying, I want to thank you for your joining us, and thanks for your comments and participation along the way. Thank you.